Hi. So, so far we have talked about all the structures of a cell and how cells are these dynamic things where we need energy as ATP and use energy. We also talked about metabolic pathways and the role of enzymes in them. We finished off by talking how materials are transported in and out of the cell using many different methods: active transport, passive transport, and bulk transport. So, I guess that today continues this story rather nicely. So we have already noted that there needs to be energy and how it is used in a cell. In this chapter, we will focus really mainly on how the energy is made inside the cell. And we remember that the key structure for this is mitochondria. You remember those were what we called as the powerhouses of the cell. This is where ATP is made. You will notice that a mitochondria had a double membrane structure. We have both outer and inner membrane. And this inner membrane is folded inside the mitochondria, forming these cristae. These are important, as you will learn later in this chapter, as certain parts of this process of making ATP take place especially here. The other thing that I want to mention that you will notice when we talk about cellular respiration, when we talk about producing ATP in this process where mitochondria plays an important role. So you do respiration too, right? So what do you need to do respiration? You need oxygen and energy in forms of sugars, typically as glucose. And the very same thing applies to cells and in particular to the mitochondria. Well, what do you produce as a result of breathing? Yes, carbon dioxide. And remember our dehydration synthesis reaction, when we make something new, where we combine smaller parts to make a bigger molecule, where we were left with additional water. So really, this is the reason why we all breathe. You breathe because your cells, and in particular mitochondria, need oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. Who knew that the reason for your breathing can be explained in this detailed level? Do you remember in chapter 4, I told you that this is my favorite formula in biology? And this formula was for photosynthesis. And here you can see all the reactants, the stuff that goes in, and all the products, which is the stuff that comes out. Well, there is a reason why I bring up this formula again. And that is that cellular respiration is essentially a reverse of photosynthesis. We just rearrange the order of what goes in and what comes out. So you see, biology is quite beautiful in a way that if you do a great job of really learning one thing well, you will find out that often you can apply that further and the coming concepts become much easier. And that is why I love biology. So, what we see in this formula of cellular respiration is quite important because it shows us two reactions that we should be aware of. Remember, these numbers were important. They tell us how many of each kind of elements we have in these molecules. And we remember that these numbers must match on the both sides of the formula something simply cannot disappear or reappear out of the blue. It's like mathematical equations that must remain in balance on both sides. So the small numbers told you that how many of those atoms you have in that molecule. And the bigger numbers told you how many of those molecules you have. Let's continue with looking in more detail into this formula. And let's start with glucose molecule. So what we see is that one glucose molecule really becomes 6 carbon dioxide molecules. And this happens by removing some hydrogen atoms. We actually have to bring in more oxygen from elsewhere, but ignore that for the time being. And the name of this reaction where we remove hydrogen atoms is called oxidation. Well, like they say in the home shopping network, but that's not all. We also have another reaction to consider. Well, reduction is a reaction where we add hydrogen atoms. And an example of reduction reaction that we see here is when oxygen molecule accepts hydrogens and becomes water. And what is especially important of redox reaction in cellular respiration is that it releases energy, which is then used by the cells. Isn't this quite pretty? And this is where we will stop this video. Next we will talk more about the phases of a glucose molecule being broken down and how ATP is released in each step. Remember that this chapter will require you to do a bit more reading independently, as our activities in this module will highlight only the very key points of this process. See you soon again!